Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 𝐡. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 was a Wu-Tang Clan affiliate rapper who did something pretty extreme when he was high on a number of drugs and he was drinking at a party in North Hollywood on the 6th of April 2004. He cut off his own penis. So what was his state of mind at the time? Was this a drug-induced psychosis? And if so, how would I treat drug-induced psychosis? What were the other kind of relevant factors and the stressors leading up to this incident? And most importantly, what is the best Wu-Tang Clan tune? I will answer all of these questions and many more in this episode. So I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist, so I regularly assess mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in secure psychiatric units with a whole range of disorders and presentations. So I've certainly assessed numerous people with drug-induced psychosis. And the reason I made this video is because I was on my boy Sean Atwood's podcast recently doing an interview, and he was telling me about his own experiences of being friends with these just crazy people who would take drugs for days and they would become psychotic and paranoid and they would behave really erratically, and poor old Sean was in the middle of it all trying to sort it all out. Go and check out that interview, by the way. And that reminded me of this story of 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜, and I think I even mentioned it in his interview, and then I thought I have to come back and research it. As I was researching it, I thought my viewers need to know about this, and that is why I'm making this video. And I will make it slightly scientific by giving you my own psychoanalysis of 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜. I'm also going to make a probably shorter follow-up video, and I'm going to tell you about a personal case that I've assessed of a man during a criminal court trial in London who also had drug-induced psychosis, and he stabbed himself through the cheek. He was also done for, I think it was actual bodily harm. If you want to know the details, look out for that video. So sit back, relax, put away any sharp implements, and welcome to Psych for Sore Minds, your one-stop shop for education about psychiatry and about criminality. So first of all, I'm going to tell you about the story. 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜, real name Andre Johnson, as in I'm going to cut off your Johnson, is now in his late 40s. He was a Wu-Tang Clan affiliate, so if you don't know who the Wu-Tang Clan is, then shame on you. In fact, shame on it who tried to run game on it, who buck wild with the trigger. Now, obviously, he was not one of the core members, but they do have these affiliates, some of whom are known as the Wu-Tang Killer Bees, as in Wu-Tang Killer Bees on the swarm, rain on your college ass disto dawn, for you to even touch my Sorry, getting carried away. But this includes rappers from other countries. And 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 was also in a separate group called North Star, and the 𝐸ZA produced his debut album in 2004. As I'm sure you guys know, the 𝐸ZA is the main producer and the founder of the Wu-Tang Clan. So what happened? Well, according to interviews that I've seen that 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 has done since then, at that time, he was in a really bad place. He was feeling lonely. There were some social factors that would have acted as triggers. This included his mother being quite unwell. He was paying child support for 3 different children, although he had restraining orders against seeing 2 of them. So I'm sure this all contributed. I'm sure this would have made him feel a bit kind of bitter and twisted and angry about this lack of access. Crucially, he'd been using a whole range of drugs heavily, and he was falling into a depression, and he's actually admitted that he was trying to kind of self-medicate by using more drugs, which is actually quite common, particularly in a certain strata of men who believe that admitting to having poor mental health is in itself a sign of weakness. So 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜 went to this party in North Hollywood, and he didn't really know many people there apart from the mates he went with. Also, in other interviews, he mentioned that he hadn't slept properly for days. So as I said, he took a range of drugs. He took PCP, he took meth, not approved by the rapper Meth from the Wu-Tang Clan. He took MDMA, he took cannabis, and he drank some alcohol. And then in his mind, he thought that his penis was the cause of many of his problems. He thought it was driving him to have promiscuous sexual relationships, like having children, but not living up to his kind of responsibilities as a father. So he thought in that mental state at the time that the best solution was to get rid of it. And also, he'd apparently been reading up about monks. He's also been reading some material about vasectomies. It's probably a bit late now, but 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜, if you're watching this, there's a big difference between a vasectomy and castration. So then 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜, he grabs this kitchen knife and he cuts off his own penis. In interviews since, he's been very keen to stress that he only cut off a portion, he didn't cut off the whole thing. And then he said he looked down and I quote, he saw it gushing like a water hose. And then he believed that he was going to die, so he jumped off a second floor balcony. And apparently he was quite lucky that he landed on the grass because he was only inches away from landing on concrete. and then his friends called an ambulance. What I think is quite interesting is in terms of the aftermath, the Wu-Tang Clan tried to separate themselves, tried to distance themselves from him, and they put up a blog shortly afterwards saying that they had absolutely nothing to do with 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺, although the post was apparently deleted, perhaps because they didn't want to look too insensitive in retrospect. And in a recent interview with TMZ, so to translate for my English viewers, that's TMZ, 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺 relayed that shortly before this, he was in his manager's house and he kind of believed that he was living in this cartoon world. So let's psychoanalyze 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺's mental state. Just because somebody does something inexplicable or extreme when they're intoxicated doesn't mean it's drug-induced psychosis. In fact, far more people do stupid things when they're simply intoxicated, wasted, like that time you did that thing, you know, with that person from work and then everybody found out. But anyway, usually people are disinhibited and they're unable to think through the consequences of their actions properly when they're high on drugs, as opposed to actual psychosis. So actual psychosis is things like hearing voices, auditory hallucinations, or having delusions. So without the benefit of assessing 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺 in person, in my view, on balance, he probably did have an actual drug-induced psychosis. And I'll tell you why I think that. Firstly, this cartoon world that he describes appears to be him struggling to kind of understand or separate fantasy from reality, which absolutely would be in keeping with a psychosis. Also, the very belief that cutting off his penis would help his problems, I think suggests this too, because that's not a logical thought. That seems to be a delusion to me, rather than being disinhibited and doing something silly that's based in reality, if that makes any sense. But I also think it's important to take into consideration all of the other social pressures. He's got an ill mother, he's got a lack of his access to children, I'm sure these contributed. Plus, he had this background of depression. Now, depression in itself very rarely presents with psychosis, the exception being very severe depression. But if somebody's that severely depressed, then they're usually not functioning. They often have to be sectioned to a psychiatric hospital. Plus, the psychosis they have has a certain quality to it. They have nihilistic delusions. So nihilistic delusions are things like believing that somebody's actually dead or that the world doesn't exist. The kind of ideas he had about his penis, to me, are not nihilistic delusions. So if I had the opportunity to assess 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺 in person, especially around that time, I would want to know firstly if he was predisposed to psychosis, because that would make it more likely that that's what this is. So for example, if he's had it before, if he's got a family history of psychosis. Plus, I would like to know his exact thought processes at the time. And I'd like to know if he had any other symptoms of psychosis at the time, like for example, if he had been hearing voices or if he'd been feeling paranoid about other people. So have any positives come out of this whole situation? I suppose he did lose a little bit of weight, maybe. No, I'm just kidding. I think generally when celebrities talk about their mental illness experiences, then it helps reduce stigma, and it might kind of encourage or embolden other people who suffered from something similar to speak out. Having said that, I think this case is unusual, as it might actually increase stigma just because the outcome and 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺's actions were so catastrophically bizarre that I think it will take away rather than add to the battle against stigma for mental illness, although I'm sure 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺 wasn't thinking about any of that at the time. Before we go on, dear viewers, I've got a couple of questions for you. First of all, who is the best member of the Wu-Tang Clan? And collectively as a group, what is their best tune? And also, what is the best individual solo artist tune? Please share your thoughts with me in the comment sections below, and I will share my thoughts on those exact questions with you later on in this video. Okay, next, let's have a look at 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺's reflections upon this whole incident. So to TMZ, he said, and I quote, "I'm the only man who did the fuck what I did, and I'm proud of it. I may have made the biggest mistake ever in history, but I'm proud of it." Not quite sure that's how pride works, 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺. So it makes me think, how can somebody have done something so extreme but be so flippant about it? So in my opinion, it does seem like there's like an element of bravado or ego damage control, I guess you could call it. 𝐼𝐵𝐵𝐺 has painstakingly told people many times in interviews that his penis is working and he's able to have sex. And also, interestingly, when he talked about jumping off the balcony, he said, and I quote, that he Supermaned it. So by him making these kind of almost brash statements, to me, he's just trying to save face. As let's face it, he's already a bit of a laughing stock in the rap community, and he's already the kind of target of people's jokes. So I think he just wants to play along as if it's not such a big deal and he's not so personally bothered by it. So in psychoanalysis speak, he's using humor as a defense mechanism, and he's probably deflecting his embarrassment. Because let's face it, right? Even if 𝐼𝐸𝐲 were to cure cancer, even if he were to discover a new renewable energy source, and even if he made soya vegetarian bacon that actually tastes nice, he's always still going to be known as that rapper who cut off his penis. So when I look at his reaction, I kind of think of him as the kid that's being bullied and he's laughing along to try and take away the impact from what the bullies are saying, but he's crying inside. Later, I will give you an update on 𝐼𝐸𝐲 and where he is in his life right now. Next, I want to tell you what drug-induced psychosis is. So it's exactly what it sounds like. A period of psychosis is, as I said before, usually characterized by voices or auditory hallucinations or delusions like paranoid, false beliefs such as about your penis or about people wanting to hurt you, for example. You can get other softer, less common signs of psychosis like thought disorder, which is when somebody's pattern of thoughts keep jumping. So when they're speaking, they're literally jumping between topics mid-sentence and it's really hard to follow what they're saying. Drug-induced psychosis is usually caused by particular drugs like PCP, amphetamines, or very strong cannabis like skunk. It's different from other psychoses like schizophrenia because it happens almost instantaneously and it lasts for only about 1 to 3 days, which is the amount of time that the drug's actually within your system, and then it resolves pretty quickly, as opposed to other psychosis which comes on very gradually over weeks or months and can last weeks or months depending on treatment. With drug-induced psychosis, you often have patchy or no memory of the incident. And as I mentioned before, it needs to be differentiated between simple intoxication. Simple intoxication might make you act kind of wild, but it doesn't lead to hallucinations or delusions like false beliefs. So how is drug-induced psychosis treated? Well, in my line of work, if somebody commits a very serious offense, when they're psychotic, then they often get sent to a specialist forensic unit for months of rehabilitation. And in fact, the case that I'm going to do that's kind of connected to this of Mr. K, who had a drug-induced psychosis, he did commit actual bodily harm. However, the waiting list for these kind of places is very long because the admissions are very long, often months, often years. And so drug-induced psychosis is different. Generally, it's not worth the process of getting somebody into a forensic unit. Occasionally, they might go to a general adult ward, which is like for typical non-offending or non-violent patients, where the turnover is much high, so people can go in there for days or weeks. But it kind of depends on whether there's space on the ward and also whether the consultant psychiatrist is willing to admit them, because they can quite reasonably say this person's going to be better in a couple of days. He doesn't actually physically need treatment. Occasionally you get people that go on the ward where you didn't diagnose drug-induced psychosis because you didn't even know that the patient took any illicit substances. Understandably, people lie about that. They might be scared of the legal repercussions, or they might be so psychotic, so confused, so perplexed, so unwell that they literally can't communicate the fact that they've taken drugs. And I've even seen cases where people have been so psychotic they've forgotten that they've taken drugs in the recent past. Police sometimes do urine drug screens, so that can tell you, but they don't do that always. So in these cases, they get admitted to the psychiatric ward, but then they get cured, or not even cured, it resolves spontaneously very quickly, so they get discharged quickly. Generally for psychosis, you can use antipsychotics, but there's not that much point in a drug-induced psychosis because it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for the psychotic squashing properties to actually take effect, although the milder sedative effects might happen a lot sooner from antipsychotics. But there are better, stronger sedatives you could use like midazolam or diazepam or lorazepam. So instead, often these people are kept in somewhere like a police cell with sedatives, and they just allow time to drugs to flush out of their system. Everybody's worst nightmare. I'll tell you a scary story, which is that a small proportion can become permanently psychotic. But just to give you a sense of relief, that's usually because these people were predisposed anyway to psychosis. For example, they had a strong family history and the drugs has just tipped them into psychosis. It's just speeded up the process and they've ended up where they would have eventually. Okay, I'm going to tell you about my Wu-Tang Clan proclivities. My favorite member, I think the most kind of polished, commercially successful, obviously, the guy that's still making new music would have to be Method Man. He's also a fairly talented actor and he was in The Wire. In terms of who I think is the musically most talented, I'm going to have to go with the RZA, who's also the most business savvy. In terms of who's the most skilled and dopest rapper, individually, that would go to the GZA. However, the question was who's my favorite? Hands down, I'm going to have to go with, of course, the ODB. The most charming, the most fun, unfortunately the most deceased. He wasn't that technically skilled, but his voice was like really, really intense and he was a larger than life character, definitely the most entertaining. In terms of my most most favourite tune that the whole group did together. I think many people would say Gravel Pit, but for me, a bit too commercial, so I'm going to go with Shame on a Negro. It's such a rude bass line, dope cut-in lyrics, closely followed by Triumph. In terms of individual songs, I'm going to have to go with 𝐏𝐬𝐲𝐜𝐡, either Liquid Swords or Bible, which stands for Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. If you don't have a clue what I'm talking about now, you definitely have to go and check all of this out. If you do know what I'm talking about, holler at me in the comments. Let me know if your opinions match mine. Okay, let's finish up by getting some closure on 𝐿𝐴. So I'm happy to say that he's turned his life around. He got happily married to a woman named Cheryl on the 30th of December 2019. He himself has repeatedly stated in interviews that he has a fulfilling sex life. And even though it's easy to laugh about this case, and obviously I've made a couple of jokes, that's fine, but I think we should bear in mind that in his psychotic state, the decisions 𝐿𝐴 made could have been very different. He could have stabbed himself fatally, he could have committed suicide, could have stabbed somebody else. In fact, the case that I keep referring to that I'm going to make in the future video, Mr. K did both of those things. He stabbed himself, stabbed his cousin. And also, we should bear in mind that suicide is a problem in psychosis in general. People with schizophrenia have 10% of them die from suicide, which is a ridiculously high number. To conclude, I'm glad things didn't go as bad as they could have done, and I'm glad 𝐿𝐴 managed to turn his life around. Last thing for me to say is welcome to this channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. I cover a whole range of topics related to mental illness, some of it related to offending, because that's my area of expertise, some of it related to more common psychiatric presentations. I talk about individual diagnoses, I go into high profile true crime cases and give you my psychoanalysis. I interview relevant people like ex-patients, etc., etc. And my USP is I talk about my real life cases like I will do in this video that I keep referencing about Mr. K. What I'm trying to say is there's something for everybody on this channel. Just wanted to quickly tell you that I will be in CrimeCon on the 25th and the 26th of September, big crime convention coming over to the UK for the first time ever. Cop your tickets. I'm going to be doing a talk about 2 real life people who've killed their own family members. And I'll tell you, one had a mental illness, one didn't, and I'll distinguish the trajectory of the 2. You need to go check it out. You can get 10% off tickets if you use the code in the description below. Right, I am done. Stay euthymic homies, and please, whatever you do, do not forget, I love you.